Story, George and Sebastian. My son George has always had the strangest friends. I'm not sure why, but in his earlier years, he always attracted what you'd call the weird kids. I've got a ton of stories about this, but there's one that sticks out like a thorn. He was in the 4th grade, and we had just moved due to my husband's reassignment. So George was new at school. He had always been an outgoing and friendly kid, so my husband and I weren't particularly worried about his ability to make new friends. We were transitioning well as a family, and everything seemed to be going fine. I was beyond pleased the first time I met all of George's classmates' parents. They all seemed like honest, upstanding people. But a few months after the move, I got a call from George's school in the middle of the day. They asked that one of his parents come in to discuss an incident involving him and another student. My husband was at work, so I agreed to go. I picked up George, and as we walked to the principal's office, I felt a mix of anger and confusion. Anger, because I assumed my son had been in a fight and might need to be punished. But confusion, too, because fighting was completely out of character for George. He wouldn't answer any of my questions on the way in, which was strange for him. He was usually very talkative, an oversharer, even, so his silence unsettled me. I figured he was either scared or embarrassed. At the office, the principal asked George to wait outside. Once the door closed, he invited me to sit. Then came the questions: how George behaves at home, whether he listens, talks back, or is respectful. I had nothing but good things to say. George was well behaved and respectful, and that wasn't just me being a biased mom. It was the truth. Finally, the principal told me why I had been called in. Apparently, George had gotten into an altercation with a classmate named Sebastian. According to the story, they were the last 2 students outside after recess. And while walking up the stairs, George suddenly pulled an eraser from his pocket and struck Sebastian on the head, causing him to fall and scream. I was baffled. That didn't sound like George at all. What made it more confusing was that George had spoken fondly of Sebastian before, like they were close friends. I asked more questions, but the principal didn't have many answers. No one had actually seen the incident. But both boys gave matching details. He assured me George wasn't in trouble, a little scuffle wasn't uncommon, and no further action would be taken. That calmed me down a bit. George stayed silent the entire ride home, and only opened up to me right before bedtime. I had grown frustrated with his silence, which probably pushed him to talk. He told me that Sebastian had tricked him. I asked what he meant. He explained that they'd been playing make-believe Street Fighter. Following Sebastian's instructions, George pulled out the eraser as a kind of KO move. Out of nowhere, Sebastian fell and pretended to be hurt. Then he whispered in George's ear that he'd seriously hurt him if George didn't go along with the story that he attacked him. So George did. And the teachers believed it was a real fight. I was furious. My little boy had been taken advantage of and falsely accused. Instead of going to the school again, I decided to handle it myself. That night, I found Sebastian's mother's number in the school directory. She introduced herself as Maggie, and I was surprised by how sweet and genuine she sounded on the phone. She said she had heard about the incident, gotten the real story from Sebastian, and had already reprimanded him. I found it odd that Sebastian would confess so quickly. But I was relieved I didn't have to argue my case. She told me Sebastian had some minor behavioral issues growing up and sometimes acted like someone else entirely. The more she shared, the more I started to feel bad. Maybe he wasn't fully in control of his actions. Maggie suggested the boys have a sleepover to make up and rebuild their friendship. She offered to host, which I appreciated. That weekend, I dropped George off at their house. Maggie invited me in, and we got to know each other over some wine while the boys played in the basement. Maggie seemed like a genuinely kind person. I stayed for a few hours, and the time flew by. Eventually, I brought up Sebastian's behavior. It had been bugging me. Her demeanor shifted. She lowered her voice and admitted Sebastian had trouble making friends. He'd seen a few doctors, and they believed he might outgrow it. She said he was getting better and more social, which was a good sign. I didn't push any further. I just wanted to be sure George would be safe. Maggie reassured me that Sebastian didn't have a history of violence, just some odd behavior. That was enough for me. It even felt nice knowing George might help Sebastian learn to make friends. When it came time to leave, I went downstairs to say goodbye. The boys were laughing and playing Battleship. They seemed to be getting along great. I kissed George goodbye and left. The next morning, I came to pick him up. George was waiting by the door with his things and a smile. I assumed everything had gone well. I greeted Maggie, packed his things, and we drove off. But as soon as we hit the road, George suddenly burst into tears. I asked what was wrong, and what he told me chilled me to my core. He said everything was fine until bedtime. The boys had set up 2 air mattresses in the basement. Everything seemed normal, but in the middle of the night, George woke up. He wasn't sure why at first, until he heard whispering. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and there was a strange flickering light inside, not like a regular bulb, more like candlelight. George listened closely. It was Sebastian talking, but not just talking. He was having a full conversation. At first, George thought maybe he was on the phone. But then it got weirder. Sebastian wasn't calling himself Sebastian. He was calling himself Mr. Jim. He was talking to the mirror, no one else. Then the candle went out, and everything went dark. George shut his eyes, pretending to be asleep. A long time passed. Then he heard the bathroom door creak open. His stomach dropped when he heard whispering again, this time, right above him. He couldn't understand the words, it didn't even sound like English. He lay there, frozen, too scared to move. Eventually, Sebastian went back to bed like nothing had happened. In the morning, he was completely normal. George didn't dare ask him about it. When George told me this, I was horrified. My gut told me this wasn't just a case of childhood imagination, something was seriously wrong. I called Maggie. At first, she laughed and said Sebastian was just a creative kid. But as I pressed her, her voice faltered. She admitted that his behavioral issues were more serious than she'd let on. One psychiatrist even suspected he had multiple personality disorder. They had already moved twice before, because Sebastian had been expelled from other schools. I was stunned. Furious. Why hadn't she told me any of this before? Why would she put my son in danger? Then she did something unexpected, she begged me not to tell the school. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to respect her. But another part of me knew something was seriously wrong. I said, okay, and hung up. I told myself I'd make a decision by the end of the week. But I never got the chance. That Monday, Sebastian attacked another student at recess. It was serious enough that the school sent out a statement to all the parents. Though the details were vague. By the end of the day, we found out he had been expelled. I tried calling Maggie, but her number had been disconnected. Just days ago, we'd spoken, and now she was gone. No other number. No email. Nothing in the school directory. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove to their house. It was completely vacated. No moving truck. No warning. No trace. Just, gone. It didn't make sense. How could they have left so quickly? I tried looking them up online. Nothing. No forwarding address. No mention of them anywhere. It was like they had never existed at all. That was a long time ago. George wasn't too badly affected by it, he's probably forgotten most of it by now. But I haven't. I still think about what could have happened to my son that night in that basement. And what that boy, Sebastian, or Mr. Jim, might be doing now.